Welcome to this RISIS Research Seminar. It's the last one of this year, and it will be devoted to joint work within the RISIS team on regional knowledge production, which exploits integration of different data sets on a common regional platform called NOMAC within RISIS. And I'm welcoming Thomas Scherngell, senior scientist at the Austrian Institute of Technology and an important specialist of regional geography of R&D and innovation. And he's also invited lecturer at the Vienna University of Economics. And I would like also to welcome Hugo Hollanders from Maastricht University, who will act as usual as discussant. As usual, this is work in progress, and this is meant also for the authors to collect feedback and directions to advance our own work about R&D and innovation. So I would like to thank also the RISIS communication team for professionally organizing this activity, and especially Alessia. Thomas, I would like to give you the word for your presentation.
Thank you, Benedetto. I will try to share my screen.
It's coming. Yes.
Yeah, then thank you, Benedetto, again for the introduction. And welcome also from my side to this research seminar. As Benedetto already mentioned, I'm just a conveyor of a multi-author, even multi-institutional work here on regional knowledge production across Europe. And so Benedetto is a co-author himself, but including also Massimiliano Guerini, Lionel Villar, and Michael Barber. And well, the background or the main trigger of this study actually has been that we in RISIS have a number of data sets featuring quite detailed geographical information on research and innovation activities. And for instance, on addresses, for instance, based on addresses of organizations participating in R&D projects, doing publications, doing patents, firm innovation, and so on. So this brings us, to our view, in a position to contribute to the research stream investigating geographical dynamics of knowledge production and innovation on the one hand, but on the other hand also raises the question, so to say, which regional breakdown, which spatial lens do we use, or is most feasible to look at geographical dynamics of research and innovation activities. And this is an important question. I mean, we can say, okay, we want to stay as flexible as possible, but our goal is also to establish, to construct indicators on the geography of R&D activities. And for this, we must decide when we construct these indicators, which regional breakdown, which spatial lens do we use. So that's so to say the more data-driven, the RISIS background for this study. And what we have tried here is to translate, because of course it's not sufficient simply to argue from a data perspective or from a data integration perspective. We have tried to translate this data integration here in a small research study that focuses here on an investigation of the regional knowledge production across Europe, insights from combined indicators, and as we think with an innovative regional delineation. So with this focus on regional knowledge production in Europe, we can say, okay, conceptually and theoretically, this study is clearly related to the geography of innovation literature. It is embedded in this research stream, and we have main arguments from this literature stream saying that the creation of new knowledge is the essential basis for innovation and therefore very important, an important driver of the overall socioeconomic development of regions or countries, or the increase or decrease, depends on how you view it, of regional disparities in geographic space. And the investigation of the geography of knowledge production, of innovation, has in this context become one of the main research domains in economic geography, in regional science, but recently also increasingly in science, technology, and innovation studies. So when we look at the literature here, we can find that many studies up to now tend to concentrate on technological activities, often other aspects, other facets of knowledge production are underemphasized. That's one issue. And the other issue is that often regional breakdowns are used in such studies that, for instance, intersect agglomerations, spatial clusters of knowledge creation, which leads to problematic interpretations in a spatial context. There are some alternatives that have been proposed recently, such as the functional urban areas approach, which provides a better delineation, but comes at the price of strongly reducing the scope because it is hardly linkable with external other data that you would like to link with. And this is where we come to our motivation here. So from this perspective, we think that we can motivate this study because there is a need for providing a richer, conceptually more in-depth empirical basis that accounts on the one hand for the multifaceted nature, complex nature of knowledge production, and on the other hand, to come up with a more meaningful and in particular fine-grained regional classification system that also accounts for metropolitan areas that we think are extremely important to be accounted for when we analyze the geography of research and innovation activities. So from that perspective, we have said here in this small study that our main goal here is to analyze the spatial distribution of knowledge production across European regions. And we focus here on the volume of knowledge production and on, so to say, the balance between a more academic and technological component or types of regions that focus on these different types of knowledge production. But, and that's probably the most important point, the third point here, we do this by introducing a regional classification approach here that to our view is more reasonable for investigating empirically geographical dynamics of knowledge production. And we put forward here a classification system that stays at the same time, and this is one strength of it, compatible for linking with external data. So that's the goal of the study. We will give you a short overview on state of the art, then relatively quickly come to the data and indicators that we have used. And then we would like to shift attention to this new regional classification system that we have developed and applied here. And then come up with some very preliminary and explorative descriptive analysis of the spatial distribution of regional knowledge production, some dimensions and also types, regional types of knowledge production. So as I have mentioned before, to go back a little bit to the theoretical conceptual background of the study. So we find triggered by the geography of innovation literature in the mid and late 1990s, this high interest in empirically observing regional knowledge production. And what to our view, what we can say by and large, there are two main challenges for advancing empirical research in that direction. That's on the one hand, the complex, the very multifaceted, heterogeneous nature of knowledge production, of knowledge creation processes. That's one issue. And the other issue is that the tracing of systematic information on knowledge production at finer and more reasonable geographical breakdowns raises challenges to data quality and geocoding algorithms, which is really something that we have tried to address also in the RISIS project specifically. We have Hugo here today. So the first research endeavors that try to address these both challenges have appeared over the past 2 decades. I would say the innovation scoreboard is one example in this direction, or the risk monitor, but still these initiatives mostly rely on aggregated data provided by statistical authorities and mostly at the so-called NUTS2 level, so a quite rough granularity of geographical breakdown. And that's where we can see that more recently we find, and RISIS is one example of it, this new focus on geocoding own raw data on knowledge production, on research and innovation activities in data sets that are enriched and handled by different institutions, most of them part of the RISIS consortium. And this geocoding, for instance, is based on addresses of, for instance, authors in publications, inventors in patents, or research project participants, firms receiving venture capital, research organizations, and so on. And from this perspective, we say, okay, this could help us to provide a richer picture of the geography of knowledge production at the more fine-grained, the more balanced, more meaningful spatial levels, and here also in particular accounting for large metropolitan or urban areas in this setting. As I've mentioned before, one major challenge is that knowledge production, of course, as we know, is not homogeneous. It's a heterogeneous process. We find in the literature different frameworks that try to categorize or characterize the heterogeneity of knowledge production processes. One very basic distinction that we can also bring forward here is to distinguish between more explorative inspired knowledge production, which is focusing on exploring new grounds, scientifically driven, versus more exploitative driven knowledge production, which is focusing from the beginning on the economic commercialization of new knowledge, which is technologically driven, application oriented. And of course, we can identify different knowledge bases and research strategies underlying those two different knowledge production modes. But we also, of course, can find or can observe a strong heterogeneity of knowledge production outputs, for instance, in terms of specific qualities of the new knowledge that has been created. And so far in geographical analysis of knowledge production, there's a strong focus on the quantity of knowledge outputs. And this is where we want to connect with these studies. So where we say, okay, on the one hand, we try to propose an indicator framework that explicitly accounts for these dimensions of heterogeneity in grasping regional knowledge production, so explorative aspects, exploitative aspects, but also quality and impact aspects, and apply the indicators that we derive from this framework to a new set of European regions that we arrive, or we are able to arrive at, by geocoding raw information on diverse kinds of knowledge production activities in the different data sets coming from RISIS that are mobilized here. So maybe let's have a look at this regional classification. As most of you for sure may know, the Eurostat NUTS classification is a de facto standard, but it is based on administrative boundaries, which raises many well-known problems. First, most variables are only available for NUTS 2, which is a very rough granularity with very different sizes, very different levels between countries, and also different treatment of large cities. This is one main disadvantage also of NUTS 2. And this recent alternative that has been put forward is to come up with so-called functional regions based on the characteristics of the phenomenon studied. And the most prominent example probably is the functional urban areas approach, which is interesting, but it has the drawback that it is not compatible with NUTS, and therefore it's difficult that we link phenomena that we observe at the Fuhr level to other characteristics or economic properties, for instance, that we would like to link with. And that's why we propose here in this study that we start our classification system building from the Eurostat metropolitan regions, which per se provides a better delineation than the original NUTS 3 because it accounts for metropolitan areas, and it is a good approximation even of the functional urban areas as we have tested, but at the same time remains compatible with the NUTS classification for matching with other data sets. But what we also do is that for regions that are outside of these metropolitan regions, we regroup all non-metropolitan or non-urban NUTS 3 regions within the same NUTS 2 region in a single region to get a more balanced regional system in terms of size, in terms of number of regions per country. And but what we do here is also that we single out a number of NUTS 3 regions with a sizable amount of knowledge production. So we do not include them in the overall NUTS 2 region, but we keep them separately. So these are NUTS 3 regions that are not part of metropolitan regions, but have a sizable amount of knowledge production. Therefore, we keep here the NUTS 3 region. And that's what we call knowledge hubs in our regional system. And let me clarify here also, this is only possible because we are able to attribute the information on different dimensions of knowledge production to the NUTS 3 level by using the RISIS geocoding facilities. And this is already an advancement per se, because as you may know from tools available like RIS Monitor, the most indicators are just available, if at all, on NUTS 2 or even NUTS 1. So that's how our regional classification system, we call it NUTS adapted, by the way. Maybe we find a better way. That's something we have to discuss in the authors. That's how it looks like in the end. So our NUTS adapted classification here covers more than 540 regions, in contrast to more than 1,400 when we would use NUTS 3. So how do we arrive at that? We have regrouped, as I have mentioned before, NUTS 3 regions into 274 metropolitan regions as defined by Eurostat. the 1000 NUTS2 regions outside of the metropolitan areas have been grouped into 251 adapted NUTS regions. So we have a drastic reduction of very small regions, and this is particularly effective for countries like Germany with extremely very many NUTS3 regions. And we have the knowledge hubs that are here indicated in the map here in purple color, that are, as I've mentioned before, smaller regions in terms of population, but with a very high amount of knowledge production. And these are typically prominent university centers, for instance, Jena, Pisa, Leuven, Cambridge, and Oxford. And this leads to our view to a more uniform, to a more balanced, more consistent regional classification systems, in particular in terms of size, but still keeps the functional approach, because the metro areas that are part of this regional classification system are very similar to the functional urban areas. We have tested this. There are 3 or 4 cases of differences. And so we stay compatible with NUTS for matching with external data, but keep the important functional approach for urban areas. So that's the core element, I would say, of this study. We have tried to apply it then to a rough investigation analysis of regional knowledge production in Europe. As I have said before, very briefly, in view of the time, we have mobilized a number of data sets available within RISIS that you can all access, by the way, via the RISIS datasets portal. This is very important for you to know also. You see that we have mobilized the CWTS publication database and the UPRO database with R&D projects for capturing explorative elements of knowledge production. We have mobilized the RISIS patent database for capturing more explorative modes of knowledge production, and we have captured firm innovation with the VICO database on startups that received VC investment, and for inputs to the knowledge creation, the European Tertiary Education Register, the ETA database. And we have extracted a number of indicators. I will not go in detail here. That's something that you can also read up in the slides. Just to mention here that we have tried to extract both indicators inferring that allow us to say something about the quantity of knowledge production in a specific region, but also the quality or a specific quality of knowledge production. For instance, we extract here the count of publications, but also the count of publications in top 10% cited. And then we have here some, I would call it normalization or control variables, like population, gross domestic product, and area. All the indicators are observed for the years 2011 and 2016 here, and these are aggregated counts from annual observations, with the exception of startups that is from 14 to 16. So let's have a look at some very basic results, and thanks to Lionel to this very beautiful map. So we start here with this, we often call it the baseline indicators of explorative versus exploitative knowledge production. So you have the number of publications on the right-hand side and the number of patents on the left side, applied to the regional classification system that we have discussed before. And so what do we see here? Of course, first we see this extreme concentration of high amounts of knowledge production in a very few number of regions. That's what Philippe Laredo always used to call islands of knowledge production in an ocean. That's what is visible for both but we see that these hotspots differ between the two modes of knowledge production, technological versus scientific. That's one issue. And the other issue is that we have some kind of urban hierarchy or regional hierarchy. So there's also a second layer of regions that play quite an important role. And we also find a specific spatial structure for this, in particular for the second layer regions, as we will see in some other analytical elements afterwards. We can also compare this with the number of students coming from the ETA data set and the number of startups. So you see the number of students in this regional setting is, of course, highly correlated with the publications, if we switch that, but includes also many Eastern European, in particular capital areas that of course have a high number of students, but are not among the top in the output of scientific publications. And for startup, we can find that obviously this concentration is even higher than for the other variables. So there are only a very few regions that have a very high number of startups. So this is obviously something that is related to a very specific regional environment and characteristics of the ecosystem of the specific region under consideration. So that's just a rough glimpse on this spatial distribution that we observe for this classification system. And of course, this regional concentration, these concentration tendencies are clearly visible. So we find a high concentration of knowledge production, and this can be underlined when we look at the Gini concentration index. On average, we find that more than 80% of knowledge is produced by the top 20% regions. And this even increases when you move from inputs, human resources, to outputs, and startups being the most concentrated variable that we are looking at here, where a few regions, a dozen of regions accounts for more than 50% in startup or VC-backed startup activity in Europe. Just as a side note, knowledge hubs that we have singled out, as I have explained before, just cover 2% of the population, but more than 6% in knowledge production. And this is somehow also underlining a little bit that it is necessary to single them out in this regional classification system that we come up here. So we can find these concentration tendencies, but the question is also whether this concentration is geographically localized. And that's a very old discussion, of course, in the geography of innovation literature. We can speculate, we can assume something from the map, but the question here is really, can we identify clusters of innovation that may be an expression of spatial spillover, agglomeration effects, also statistically? And here we can mobilize instruments from spatial statistics that are, by the way, remarkably underrepresented in STI studies that analyzes the geography of R&I. And the Moran's eye statistic is the most basic statistic that statistically measures spatial clustering or spatial dependence. Spatial autocorrelation is the statistical notion in a data set or in a given, for a specific variable in a system of regions. And you can see in the definition of the Moran's eye, it is simply the variance, the ratio of the variance of a variable with its so-called spatial autocovariance. And this is the core here of the Moran's eye statistic. So it is the deviation from the mean in one region multiplied by the deviation from the mean in a variable in all other regions. And this is again multiplied with the so-called spatial weight matrix that is a mathematical configuration or a mathematical description of the geographical configuration of a regional setting. So when you have the regions in the columns and the rows of this matrix, the cells are set to 1 when two regions are neighbors and otherwise. So this is just very roughly the basics of this statistic. For us now, it's important to have in mind that values, so the statistic ranges from -1 to 1, and values above 0 indicate, if it is statistically significant, indicate positive spatial autocorrelation or spatial clustering for a variable. And yeah, we have applied this here to, again, first to our two baseline variables on technological knowledge production and scientific knowledge production. And you see we can illustrate the index simply when we plot the patterns or the log of patterns here given in a Z-score form in one region. So one region is one dot here against the number of patterns in the neighboring regions, which is called the spatial lag of the log of the patterns here. And the same we have done here for scientific knowledge production. And we find a very interesting insight here. You can see that the spatial dependence, the spatial clustering tendency is obviously much higher for technological knowledge production than for scientific knowledge production. And this is underlined here also by the Moran's I values that we have indicated here. You can see that it is much higher for patterns than for publications, and it is not significant or nearly 0 for startups and the number of students. So this is an interesting observation that we can sum up in a way that technological knowledge production has the highest spatial clustering tendencies. So neighboring regions with a high number of patterns also tend to have more patterns than the average. This is moderate, significantly lower for scientific knowledge production, that in comparison to patenting, knowledge production is more bounded within the region on the one hand, and on the other hand, more related to regions, to university regions located further away in geographical space. And for tertiary education and startups, we do not find these clustering tendencies at all. So very low spatial clustering for tertiary education. The number of students in a region is not depending on the number of students in neighboring ones. And for startups, we have already seen that in the map. It is completely unrelated to the number of startups in the neighboring regions. So it's something that is very specific to region internal characteristics, obviously. So we can also detect not any spatial spillover effects for this variable for startups. So this is, of course, related to a number of different characteristics, is related to the mobility of knowledge that is at stake in the different knowledge production modes, and also probably to different regional types. And that's the last analytical element that we have done in this small study. So we have asked ourselves, can we identify these different types of regions by a simple principal component analysis? And you see that we have used also the normalization variables here, GDP, total population and area in this context, and that we very clearly, without digging deeper into this here now, with 3 components in this setup, where the first component is clearly related to scientific knowledge production and entrepreneurship. This is, to our view, a very interesting point. So the entrepreneurship dimension that we cover by the startups variable is more related to regions that have a high amount of scientific knowledge production than to the component 2, that is the component that is more related to the local level of innovativeness and competitiveness in terms of GDP per capita and patenting intensity. And the component 3 are large, less populated areas. And as you can see, the component 3 in this perspective is also not correlated to the first 2 components, but the first 2 components show a moderate correlation. So of course, scientific knowledge production is related to technological knowledge production, is not completely unrelated. And this can also be illustrated when we try to plot the scores of the component 2, technology knowledge production, against the scores of the for each region for the component 1 on scientific, more focusing on scientific knowledge production. So of course we have these leading regions in the 2 components, but also we have this overlap between these 2 components. And of course this is very roughly, but here also we could use this analysis to zoom into this picture and single out specific roles of region, specific types, and then again where they are located. So these are the main analytical elements that we have tried to put forward in this small research study. Let me summarize the main points. We have said that we identified 2 major challenges for advancing empirical investigation of the geography of knowledge production and innovation. On the one hand, the multifaceted nature of knowledge creation, and on the other hand, to observe knowledge production at meaningful and sufficiently fine-grained spatial levels. And we have tried to present a pathway with this study to address these both challenges by mobilizing and integrating data sets and services that we have developed in the RISIS projects. We have on the one hand come up with new indicators at this regional classification system, for instance, students and startups, but also with traditional ones like patents, publications, projects. But we have geocoded them from the raw organizational level information that we have integrated and enriched within RISIS, and we have applied them here to a more suitable to our view geographical breakdown, combining metropolitan regions with adapted NUTS regions. So we have just done some preliminary analytical exercises. Of course, this is just the beginning of a longer work, but probably also influencing other works. We find a strong spatial concentration, in particular for exploitation-oriented knowledge production. We can identify different hotspots for different knowledge production types. We can identify spatial clustering tendencies. I have personally the feeling that they are more robustly identified with this new classification system than for previous research, showing a high spatial dependence for technological knowledge production, while a moderate spatial clustering for science and even none for startups and students. And we can identify some main regional types of knowledge production. One type that we would describe as knowledge exploring regions with high volume of education, but also startups. A second type of knowledge exploiting regions in terms of technological knowledge production, and the third type of rural and lagging regions. And as I've mentioned before, this is of course only a very rough analysis in this context, but to our view, this work could provide an important entry point for advancing research on the geography of innovation by mobilizing geocoded microdata, by mobilizing microdata on different aspects of knowledge production. And it is applied here to a regional breakdown that to our view is more suitable for analyzing the geography of knowledge production, and at the same time we stay compatible with regional statistics provided by Eurostat. So of course one main element of future research is that it needs to be better targeted towards more specific questions. That's not how far we have come in this study. And in this perspective, there's also then a need to shift from a descriptive approach that we have chosen here to an explanatory and dynamic perspective. That's one issue. And the other issue would be, to our view, that for a more direct connection to policy debates, for instance, smart specialization, we need to still expand the indicator framework, for instance, in terms of regional knowledge complexity or technological relatedness measures. Let me close, Benedetto, with the final slide, because maybe participants are interested because you can access actually all this data. If you want, you can play around with it, you can use it in your own research. So you have the different directions for this. So most importantly, in context of this study, is the so-called NOMAC tool that you can reach under nomac.eu, which actually provides public access to these indicators we have discussed now and also employed at this regional setting that we have discussed. But you could also access the underlying raw data, as I've mentioned before, via the RISIS datasets portal, if you want to mobilize this in your own research activities. And you could also access, and this is publicly available also, to organization level indicators, for instance, via the ETA database or the OGREC database, accessible via the links provided here.
Thank you, Thomas.
I'd like to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for an excellent presentation. Could you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, I will stop.
I want to emphasize two aspects. One, the potential of combining data sources, which is based on creating a sustainable infrastructure, and also the importance of methodological work around the regional classification, which is both robust in terms of delimitation of regions and compatible with official statistics, since we don't want to reinvent the wheel in terms of data. I would like to give the word to Hugo for your comments, criticism, suggestions on this work. Thank you, Hugo.
Okay, well, thank you, Benedetto. Thank you, Thomas, for the presentation. First of all, I'm happy to attend this seminar. I read the paper with a lot of pleasure. Of course, I have comments. I have some suggestions. I will have positive comments. I will have some negative comments. I guess I was invited based on the work I've been doing on mainly on regional innovation data in the past, which was exploited in the Regional Innovation Scoreboard, which has been on the market since 2002. So that's almost 20 years. But let me first, let me try to keep it brief. Let me first say what I like about the paper and what I do not like. You have two, say, main claims where you make improvements. One is the geocoding of raw data. And I think here you and also the project are really making a contribution to data availability, to the kind of, say, more detailed data at the NUTS3 level, which can be used not only in the RISIS project, but also in other projects. Here, I really think that your claim of introducing something new and doing something new, that is valid. The other point about this, what you call an innovative regional delineation, I'm not so convinced, because what you basically do, you take the existing NUTS classification, you take the existing classification of Eurostat on metropolitan regions, you copy the classification of metropolitan regions, then you could say everything which is not metropolitan, all NUTS3 regions which are not metropolitan are grouped in the overarching NUTS2 region. That's not really innovative. So the only innovative part is the definition of knowledge hubs. But the knowledge hubs represent, I calculated, less than 2% of the regions. And so your new taxonomy applies to 2% of the region. So I would not really see this, say, as a major breakthrough, but I like the idea. I like the idea of what you're trying to do, but I'm more convinced by the new data that you are proposing and the new data that you are using. Okay, a few comments and a few questions. First of all, on the data that you've been used for constructing the indicators. Some of the definitions. For example, you define international publications as all publications where there's at least one address outside of Europe. I was wondering how Europe is being defined. Is this just European Union? Are these all European countries? To what extent, for example, would a slightly different definition have an impact on the results? I was also like how you defined the number of EU FP projects or project participation. So at least one organization should be established in the region. Doesn't this introduce a bias towards regions which have universities? I know that universities and research organizations and private companies can be involved in framework projects, but still universities will be overrepresented. So somehow I have the idea that the definition already introduces a bias towards metropolitan regions, because in metropolitan regions you usually find more universities. The same for these transnational priority patent applications. I was wondering if this indicator introduces a bias in favor of those regions where you find, say, large shares of high shares of large firms. Maybe not that relevant because the indicator as such is not really being used in much of the subsequent analysis. I was also a bit surprised initially by the indicator on startups that received at least one venture capital investment using the VICO database, because in the paper that you shared, this is not discussed. So I had to go to the website to find out what is the VICO database, what is the source of these venture capital investments. It's better explained in the presentation, but I think you have to address this also in the paper. I think that you probably are using this indicator as a proxy for entrepreneurial innovative activities. So to what extent knowledge is being used for new business activities. What is missing is, of course, as this indicator captures new activities, but it does not capture, say, entrepreneurial or innovative activities within existing firms. Because a lot of innovation and also knowledge absorption takes place in existing firms, in existing firm activities, and this is not captured by this indicator. So it's not that I'm asking you to, say, redefine the indicator, but maybe also like in future research, try to find, identify an indicator which can also capture innovative activities within existing firms. It's more easy to say than to do, because I know about the limitations of finding regional data on innovation activities. Some questions on the results. You say that you regrouped these 1,441 NUTS 3 regions into 447 regions, of which 274 are metropolitan regions, 251 are adapted NUTS 2 regions, and 18 are knowledge hubs. If you add up 18, 251, and 274, if you add up these numbers, you do not end up with a list of 547 regions. So some regions seem to be missing. They either are not a metropolitan region, they're not a knowledge hub, and they're not an adapted NUTS 2 region. Maybe something to look into. It's not necessary to answer this now. I also think that some of your results are not, say, too surprising, because we know also from other research that knowledge activities are concentrated in metropolitan areas, because in metropolitan areas you find your universities, and in metropolitan areas you find your government services. And governments, for example, on average also employ higher shares of more highly educated personnel. So that metropolitan areas stand out is probably an expected results, because knowledge is concentrated in these metropolitan areas. And if you look at the 4 maps that are on the paper and also the 4 maps that you had on in the presentation. I think the red spots where you will find the top performing regions, they're quite comparable. They're mostly linked to large capital metropolitan regions. That also makes me wonder about how your indicators have been defined, because the paper suggests it's like absolute number, the number of publications, the number of patents, the number of startups. And I was wondering, has this been normalized to take account differences in the size of regions? If not, I'm not too surprised that metropolitan regions stand out, because if you work with absolute levels, then large regions are, will of course perform differently and will perform better than medium-sized or smaller regions. I was also the analysis based on the factor analysis or the principal component analysis. So the results that you have on slide number 18, where you identify these 3 components. One is related to scientific knowledge production, entrepreneurship, and the second one is related to innovativeness and competitiveness. I was surprised because I would expect that the indicator on startups should be part of the second component, that it should be linked to business activities. So to the technology activities measured by patents, and that should not be in the same component as research activities. So I was wondering if you also found this like a bit of a counterintuitive result, and if yes, if you have looked into possible explanations why this indicator on startups is in the first component and not in the second component. I'm also curious to know, because you're defining a longer list of indicators, including quality aspects of publications and quality aspects of patents, but you do not include these in the principal component analysis. And I'm wondering why. And I'm also wondering if you would include them, if this would have an impact on your results. So my question is, why did you work with a smaller list of indicators in your principal component analysis than in the longer list that was defined on, well, I can give you the slide number, on slide 11 in the presentation. I have 2 minor comments, personal comments, in particular because on page 12 in the paper you make 2 claims on the regional innovation scoreboard. And I see this, I take this a bit personal, and I think both are not entirely correct. And I would ask you to maybe reconsider. One is that you say that the regional innovation scoreboard looks at different indicators on knowledge, inputs, throughputs, and outputs. Well, of course, the regional innovation scoreboard is not on knowledge, it's about innovation. Maybe you would have to reframe this a bit, but also on page 12 in the paper, you say that the risk relies on data provided by Eurostat and not on raw data of different large-scale databases. Well, in fact, we do, because we also use publication data, which are even available at the NUTS 3 level. And we also, for example, use data from Potsdam on regional patent data. So also for the regional innovation scoreboard, we use not only say the traditional NUTS 2 level data, which are available from Eurostat, but also other data sources are being exploited. And I'm curious at some point, because we get our publication data at the NUTS 3 level from Science Metrics. And I'm curious at some point I will make a comparison with the data that you have been geocoding to see to what extent there's a difference. So to summarize, I really like the paper. I like what you're doing and trying to come up with new data, in particular at a more detailed level, because we know that there's also from policymakers, there's an interest to know what's happening at the NUTS 3 level. NUTS 2 is not the most suited regional breakdown. It combines larger cities with rural countryside and many NUTS 2 regions. So being able to go down to the NUTS 3 is much better. But I do think that the way that you are presenting the results and that you're presenting your approach can be improved. But I will also send you more comments by email. So those were my 10 minutes. So I'm happy to return the words and to get some responses to my comments.
Thank you, Hugo, for very detailed and careful reading and methodological comments. It's a big help. I would suggest Thomas to give you the word for a short reply and to open the box for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you, Hugo, for this very valid, detailed, and all very useful comments that I mostly can agree with. I mean, Alessio, I think we have recorded it anyway, because that we have these details then also, even if Hugo provides also some written comments. So let me just reflect on some points you have raised, Hugo. First, we are quite happy, of course, that you acknowledge that these geocoding activities, where we have really put a lot of efforts into it over the past years, is worth doing it. Even if it is to advance the field in general, and probably to come to an advancement of this research stream investigating geography of knowledge production and innovation in general. You mentioned that the regional delineation is not a breakthrough. Of course, we fully agree on that, but it's very interesting that it hasn't been put forward then so far. So you find a lot of these initiatives like the RIS monitor completely at NUTS 3, at NUTS 2. You do not find a project or initiative that comes up with this very specific. So it was methodologically not a breakthrough, but probably as an idea to bring forward indicators on knowledge production with this kind of regional setting derived from the conceptual considerations, but also the data side is probably a good idea, though not a methodological breakthrough. We fully agree, of course, on that. And also one of our main points here is really that because we played around with functional urban areas a lot also, and then in some works we had problems to match it with other control variables, R&D expenditures and these kind of things. And that's also one major element that's not a methodological breakthrough, but a good idea to keep this correspondence with NUTS, but at the same time to be able to account for metropolitan regions and metropolitan areas in this regional classification system that we have defined here. Let me respond to some details that you have mentioned. The definition of international publication is European Union plus associated countries. So European Union, outside European Union plus associated is viewed as international publication. FP projects, I do not fully share your view that this is mainly then related to university locations. If you look at the FP distribution of projects, it's by volume, the universities and the research organizations are by far on the top. But in terms of number of participations, you will find a third participation from industry, roughly a third on research organizations, and another third on universities. So this is quite, of course, given by the participation rules in the framework programs, quite balanced, and even more differs very significantly across different program domains within the framework program. So probably here it would be more interesting to disentangle, for instance, societal challenges program versus industrial leadership programs and so on. So I think we can put this discussion forward on this indicator, maybe more in this direction. The WICO database, I agree, it must be better defined, better discussed in the paper. And what you have said, also the number of regions, we need to check finally what is the sum of the region. The results are not surprising. Yes and no, because what you have mentioned about startups, this was also for us, of course. And unfortunately, I think Massimiliano is not here today, because I have just discussed with him this result also last week, that the startups appear or come up in the component with more, in the regions, in the component with more scientifically oriented knowledge creation. And of course, this is something, this is a surprising results that we can, that is one point for a follow-up research in an explanatory framework. But of course, we can have some explanations for this, that these, where these startups occur, are related to specific regional ecosystem, a regional characteristic of the innovation system that also features universities. Many of them are related to spin-offs directly from universities that are in a specific regional surrounding. And that's obviously why it comes up more, the startups in this component than in the technological component that is more driven by large firms, by technologically oriented firms. And this may be one explanation of it, which is quite interesting then, because then the startup discussion can also be very nicely related to a spatial dimension. So do we have these startups really around university places in favor? And that's something that could be speculated based on the results we have, but of course would be subject to a more explanatory framework than in a spatial model, for instance. But of course, this is also related to what you have said, that startups do not cover whole entrepreneurial activities. So I also take this as a note that we have to put this into perspective a little bit, what startups actually measures. What other points? One last point. Your about the scoreboard. I was just not, or we were just not sure, because we did not find the NUTS 3 level indicators, at least in the public tools available. Is this only NUTS 1, NUTS 2? That's at least what we have found, and that's why we thought that it is at this very rough level of granularity. So this is my question back, but it's true that we have to put this into perspective in the paper also, of course. Yeah, this is response.
Yeah.
Can I quickly give a reply?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. One, I agree. I think I support the idea, metropolitan regions, that this has to be promoted much more, because I think we do need more access to data at the NUTS 3 level. About the Regional Innovation Scoreboard, we do have a lot of data available at the NUTS 3, but it's not being published because we are constrained by the availability of regional data coming from the Community Innovation Survey. And at the moment, the best we can get from statistical offices is NUTS 2. So the availability of regional CIS data defines the NUTS level that we use in the Regional Innovation Scoreboard. So we are hoping that maybe that at some future point of time, also regional NUTS 3 data will become available for CIS data.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor for questions for this very, very interesting debate about regional development and data. Who wants to break the ice?
Maybe, if that's okay, because
yes,
that's also something that Thomas just mentioned with the ecosystem, and also based on the assumption that I also want to add a comment to, that if you have universities, there might be also a correlation in terms of startups. I think that's a very interesting point, especially if you look, not only at the Silicon Valley and how everything originated, or the MIT, but also like Cambridge and all that, but also here in Europe, you can really see the phenomena, be it in Munich. However, I think what's very interesting is also that universities collaborate a lot with the industry, right? So that is maybe something that I don't know how to capture that on NUTS 3 level, but to really look at the concentration of the industry, whether you had that in mind, looking at a Herfindahl index or anything else. If I think about Eindhoven, for instance, you had a very high number in patents. yeah, we have Philips there. So I think that's, of course, it makes sense. And I also know that the Technical University in Eindhoven collaborates a lot with the industry. So I don't know whether it's out of scope, whether you want to take that into consideration.
Thank you. I suggest we collect a few questions. Who wants to ask? Philippe?
Yes, I wanted to make a comment and have a question. I'm not surprised. Contrary to Hugo, I'm not surprised about the link between science and startups. It was my hypothesis, starting hypothesis. Because startups I mean, they produce a few patents, but the core of patents are produced by very large firms, and these large firms drive the positioning of regions. This is not for a mystery that you have mentioned, for example, over in a top publication, or even if you want Eindhoven. But Eindhoven production of patents is completely linked to Philips production of patents. You do not see anything else because it's completely dominated. This is why taking the startups drives us to think about knowledge at the frontier. This is where startups are, and knowledge at the frontier is not dominated by existing dominant designs, which is what, when you look at patents as globally, what patents reflect. So we have developed another database of fast-growing mid-sized firms because we do think that they might be a very interesting explanatory factor of the dynamics of other than the very big regions. And it's probably in that direction that I would see a way to enrich the analysis of the knowledge and innovation dynamics of metropolitan areas at large. So that was my first comment and the direction towards for the future. And my second comment is about what you discussed about metropolitan areas. There's been a lot of effort at OECD level to build the notion of functional urban areas, which I find very powerful. But they have the problem that they mirror well knowledge production, but they do not connect with the other sources, classical sources about statistical data available. So this is why this NUTS 3+ classification is made. It is to find a sort of a connection between these functional urban areas definition on one side and the existence of statistical data on the other side. And the demonstration that has been made is that when you use the NUTS 3, this is quite well, it fits quite well between both. Whenever we do, in all the tests we have done, that Thomas and Lionel have done together, all right? So I do think that we are in an intermediary way of looking at geographical agglomerations, which enable to really tap within both statistical and more and other types of data. And I really think that even for the scoreboard, that type of analysis really would be useful for the future.
Thank you, Philippe. Other questions? I must say I fully support the remark of Philippe, who was at the beginning very skeptical about this NUTS 3 adapted. We had to convince him. Is not particularly genial or complicated. It's a very pragmatic way to put together functional structure and administrative statistics. So in a way, I buy the observation of Hugo is not something extremely new, but I think the remark of Thomas, it's important why people did not start using this, because what we have seen, it solves so many problems of the NUTS 3 level in cities and in rural regions as well, like in Germany, that it's something useful. So we would not claim to have invented something absolutely new. Other questions?
If I may, just for a last comment for Hugo. Hugo, if you want to test, you go to Cortex Geospatial, you take 50,000 any type of file, and you can map it at NUTS 2, NUTS 3, or functional urban areas. All right, and then you can make comparisons. We have built a public good there, which is available to everybody.
Thank you. Other questions? If not, I would give back the word first to Thomas for a final rejoinder.
Oh, I think it's, I agree with what Philippe said, and we had a long discussion about it, Philippe. It's nice that we arrive at something that we can also present to the outside and go forward in RISIS, because as I always say, the one thing is how do we present our indicators? But we always have to have in mind that we are always able at the level of our geocoded data to go to any kind of classification. That's always what we have to have in mind. So that's what we want to produce indicators and provide it to the public, to the research community, but also to policymakers. But at the same time, with our geocoded data, everybody can use their own classifications also, and maybe go, because maybe NUTS 3 maybe is useful for some other questions. But I would like to on the question of Julia also, of course, science industry is absolutely not out of scope. This is because it is an important explanation factor of what we see probably in the spatial distribution of the variables. And what is also nicely here in this framework, because with the data that we have, we can always expand the set of indicators. Because what you are talking about is to integrate network indicators in our list of variables. And for instance, we could simply add the number of joint projects between science and industry, of joint publications between science and industry, of joint patents even between science and industry for the regions as an explanatory factor to explain what we observe in the geographical dynamics. So that's absolutely not out of scope and the topic for the future.
Thank you, Thomas.
Would you authorize me to ask a question?
Oh.
You had a...
I have to think about, okay, yes.
You had a question by Hugo, which you didn't answer, about the role of quality aspects for publications and patents, which I think might make a big difference. I mean, look at what we do using international patents or using patents that have been extended into the main offices as a measure of quality. I wonder whether when you use this type of indicators, does it change the landscape or not, or is it for the future work that you are discussing?
So what I remind is that at first level, it does not make a big difference, and I would not even maybe that the PCA has been made including those indicators, and Massimiliano just reported the main ones. But there is a question which is relevant by Hugo, is normalization.
Yeah.
Of course, as soon as you use international patents and patents, or top cited, top 10% cited publication and publication, you have a so huge size effects that things to disappear. And of course, the issue of using normalized indicators is relevant. Of course, you have to be careful, and Hugo knows, because normalized indicators, for example, against population, generates outliers. You get an island with two goats, 3 cores, and 1 habitant, and the habitat makes 2 publications, and pops up in your distribution immediately. So it requires careful thinking, but I agree that's an important dimension. And getting rid of this giant size component is essential to get robust results, because otherwise everything disappears as everything appears with size.
Just another hypothesis I just discussed with a few mathematicians recently about our highly skewed distributions. They tended to say that it might be interesting to have a main explanation that gives you a list of top regions, for example, and then to apply another approach to all the other regions to discuss how do they behave, how did they evolve. So not treat everything at once, but at multiple rounds of treatments with different ways of in each treatment to proceed in each treatment. And that has been used in epidemiology and is very used for COVID, for example, in epidemiology. And I do think it might be very useful for us to think of this type of successive layers of treatment.
Yeah, for our database, given the structure we have two outliers which should be treated separately, which are London and Paris.
Yeah.
Size metropolitan, sure. It's completely outlying. Then, of course, all the rest, you get this distribution. You can also treat with log transformations and all kind of transformations. You know, in some work on universities, you can use quartile regressions or these kind of models which treat differently different area size. But that's perfectly correct, because you cannot hypothesize that the underlying relationships are the same on different regions of different size. Yeah. That's absolutely correct. If there are no other comments, I ask Alessia to show the next seminar. So it will be the 12th of January next year. It will be presented by Pedro Pineda, University of Bath, who is currently visiting in my group, and with the discussant Jürgen Enders, who is also in Bath. It will be on empirical work on structure of academic staff in higher education, which is developed in close cooperation also with OECD, and is breaking new ground, I think, in this kind of data. And I want to remind the RISIS Research Seminar series will go on monthly basis. And for 2022, we still have some slots available. So, of course, this will be very quickly populated, but if some of you find this is a good place to present your research in a field related to RISIS, please send me a message, and I will manage this in the calendar. You are welcome to present. It's a place to present and to discuss and to get feedback on your results. With this, I want to thank Thomas, Hugo, all the participants, and Alessia for setting up this meeting, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon.